Returnee to the festival yet again. Roger Moorhouse has been with us, I think, on 3-4 occasions so far. He's a fantastic historian, specialising in the history of the Second World War. And I have to say, he is, I can safely say, the only speaker this afternoon, or indeed in the entire festival, who holds the Knight's Cross of the Order of Merit in Poland. So I want you to be very extra polite to him, because he's the ambassador, I believe, is here, so that we could be in trouble if you don't pay him enough respect. I'm also delighted to say that I think for the first time at the festival we have historian Jenna Byers. Jenna is going to be talking to Roger, and Jenna is in UCD and specialises in 20th century European history with a focus on war and conflict. So as you can see, we choose these people very carefully. You're in good hands, and don't forget to keep your questions in hand. There will be time afterwards, and Roger will be only too delighted to sign his book as well. So to talk about Wolfpack inside Hitler's U-boat war, please welcome, with Jenna Byers, Roger Moorhouse.
Hello, thank you all for being here. I'm aware there's 67 different other events you could have been at today, so thank you very much for choosing us. I apologise for the speed I'm going to speak at in advance. If I go too fast, please do let me know. So yes, obviously we have Roger here. Thank you so much for joining us. So what we're going to do, guys, is we're going to start with, I get to start with the questions because I'm the person up here on stage, but you guys will get an opportunity to ask your own questions, so do please hold them in mind. Unless there's anything particularly deeply burning important that context you think people need in order to understand this book, because I'm aware that only some of us have had the opportunity to read it in advance. Mm-hmm. What do you think people need to know in order to understand, appreciate this book?
I think the key point in terms of the concept of it is that it's essentially looking at the Battle of the Atlantic and the wider U-boat war from a German perspective. Which is something that is quite novel. Most of the literature, and there is considerable literature, as you know, on the U-boat war in World War II. It's still one of those subjects, courtesy of Wolfgang Petersen and Das Boot back in 1981. It's still a subject that is considered sexy, in inverted commas. So there's quite a lot of literature on it, but very often it's viewed resolutely, from the Allied perspective, from the perspective of the merchantmen and the destroyers. And what I decided to do with this was to try and flip that perspective by 180 degrees and to try and tell the same narrative of the wider U-boat war, but from a German perspective. So, what was life like spending 2 months in a U-boat? What did they eat? What did they think they were doing? How did they perceive their own task? What was the training like, and so on? So that's sort of the key premise of it. And then beyond that, in terms of the two, which I'm sure we'll come on to, Jenna, but the two sort of overarching conclusions that I arrived at, surprising to myself as well, one of which was that it's actually a relatively clean conflict, certainly compared to some of the other theatres that I've looked at, not least, as you heard in the introduction, looking at Poland, which is anything but. So in contrast, this is a pretty clean conflict, which is remarkable. And also that I think the degree to which this is viewed in the English language literature as a close-run thing, and this was riffing on the Churchill quote about being the only thing he was ever scared of. I think that's been overblown, and I think if you look at it from the German perspective, and if you look at the statistics, then it becomes pretty clear that actually, certainly from the second half of the war, this was a turkey shoot, and where there was a window of opportunity for the Germans, which there was with 40-41, that was, in a sense, too early. They didn't have the numbers to make it tell.
They didn't have enough U-boats yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think, actually, that's touched on two things I thought were interesting about this, because I was quite surprised. You mentioned this idea that this is seen as, or that you were surprised about how clean a war this was. Was it a shock to you to discover that in the early phases of the war, U-boat sailors are actually out rescuing the people from the ships they've knocked down?
Yeah. It's completely sort of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And especially, as I said, having come from essentially the Eastern Front, having looked a lot at Polish history and so on, I'm fully aware that I always describe it as an Eastern War and a Western War, right, on land. You've got an Eastern War, and this isn't that then that German soldiers are sort of, I suppose, reining themselves in terribly in the Western theatre, but there's a degree of respect for the opponent. They respect the opponent at least as a human being, which they don't do in the Eastern Front, right? So across the Eastern Front, it's a thoroughly murderous experience. No quarter given, no quarter expected. And you can see eruptions of the Eastern War in the West in moments like Oradour, for example, the massacre at Oradour. And that was a unit that had come from the East and essentially used Eastern tactics to quell dissent in rural France. So I was quite aware of that you've got these divisions, these differences going on. But I suppose the assumption was that you'd have a few more Oradours perhaps in the naval war and in the submarine war. And there's actually only one. There's only one sort of documented war crime committed by U-boat crews.
Yeah, which I think is in the book. It's quite a central piece in the book. I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that. It's the Peleus, right? Yeah,
that's the Peleus, which was a Greek merchantman, which was sunk in the spring of 1944 off West Africa. And in the aftermath, the U-boat commander sort of, as was normal, he surfaced and, you'd sort of interrogate survivors and so on and see what was going on. You'd see essentially what the vessel was, because they didn't know necessarily. So they would ask what the vessel was, what country, what flag it flew under, what it was carrying and so on. He'd done that and then sort of went to pull away. And there's this obvious realization that he has created a sort of a debris field which is going to betray his position to Allied aircraft, which means that the best he can do is to get away for about 200 miles, which won't be enough. So he decides to try and get rid of the debris, basically, using hand grenades and machine guns, which of course means that those crewmen that survived the sinking are clinging to the said debris, are in grave peril. Only 3 people survived the experience.
Out of how many would have been on the Peleus?
It's not entirely clear. I think it's about 30. So it's pretty brutal. But again, I think if it's possible to, and without wanting to, give someone like that the benefit of the doubt, he incidentally was executed by the British after the war. Without wanting to give him the benefit of the doubt, he was told explicitly, this is late in the war, to be extremely careful about covering his tracks because of the aerial superiority that the Allies had. So I think you can make the case, and this is not to excuse it, but you can make the case that he does what he does essentially out of fear, rather than any sense that this is retribution or sort of wanton bloodlust.
So then could we make an argument that by this stage in the war, the U-boat commanders are sort of in a catch-22 situation? Because obviously their job is to go out and sink ships. But if they sink ships, they leave debris fields that mean they're going to get caught.
Yes,
so
precisely.
How on earth are they supposed to square that circle?
Yeah. And he solves that conundrum by machine gunning and trying to destroy the debris. Yes. Unsuccessfully.
It's more an action out of panic rather than...
Exactly. That would be my argument, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, coming back to that very original point that you were talking about, this idea that you wanted to flip the narrative sort of 180 degrees and look at things, look at Germans essentially as people rather than as faceless Nazis.
Yeah.
Do you think that we need the sort of 80 years distance we have from the end of the war and the sort of the bit more perspective that gives us in order to be able to see Germans in the war as people first and Nazis second?
I think we probably do. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to forget, the cause that they're fighting for. And I make that point very plain in the conclusion. It doesn't make any sense to forget that bit, that the cause that these men are fighting for is absolutely abhorrent. And it's a very good thing that they were defeated, absolutely. But at the same time, and I think to come back to your question, I think that is a crucial qualification, that perhaps we need that, the 8 decades, to actually view them as human beings, perhaps first, and secondarily as representatives of an abhorrent regime. But surely after that time, I mean, I can understand for those that perhaps served at the time, those that, the immediate family of those that served at the time, you need that expanse of time to have some degree of perspective and to even ask the question, who were these people? What did they think they were doing? What was life like on a U-boat, rather than just kind of dismissing them as a sort of amorphous, faceless mass of the enemy.
Which isn't necessarily a helpful way of breaking down history.
It's not, and I think as historians as well, what task do we have? Is our task to sort of push, national propaganda, or is it to try and understand history better? And if it's to try and understand, history better, then we need to know what the enemy was thinking as well.
And I think this is an interesting point that you make, that the people who are serving on the U-boats get younger and younger as the year goes on, sort of their overall age. So what does a 19-year-old who gets conscripted to the German Navy think he is doing there?
Well, he's serving. I mean, it's fundamentally patriotism with obviously an admixture of ideology to it. It depends on the individual as to how much of that ideology they've taken on board. The U-boat arm is a cross-section, the men within it is a cross-section of German society. So you have, and this was quite surprising to me, you have anti-Nazis in there as well as fervent Nazis and everything in between, the broad mass of people who, to a large extent sort of go with the flow and they're quite happy to serve the regime. To them, their primary service is serving Germany, but if it's in that Nazi guise, then they'll go along with that. Hitler has a great kudos and great, personal power and charisma. That mustn't be forgotten. It's interesting, actually, the effect that his suicide has, as far as we can tell from the available accounts, on U-boat crews. Because there are some examples of recruits, for example, when they're told of Hitler's suicide, running away. So this is, to them, that the war's over.
If
right?
he's not there,
if he's not there, we're done. Which is, I think, is quite interesting. And then there are others, who the moment that they heard that he'd killed himself, it's like the spell had gone. So he wasn't a Superman after all. Which is, again, I think is quite telling.
Yeah, it speaks to this concept of charismatic leadership.
Yeah.
And that question that we often ask, not that I necessarily subscribe to the theory of great man history, being a woman of all people, but the idea that Hitler is in a particular place at a particular time that allows him to manipulate a set of forces that are already there. And the idea that it wasn't him. And so this notion that there are soldiers who are finding out he's not there anymore. It's not that the Nazis have fallen, it's not that the regime has ended.
It's him.
That had sort of come
Exactly.
already.
It's very, very personalized.
Tied into him. And so what are the records you're finding? Like, are there diaries? Is it interviews? How are you getting the people's kind of interior lives?
There's a very good archive in a place called Cuxhaven in northern Germany, on the North Sea coast, which I used quite extensively. And that was a private archive set up after the war by a chap called Horst Bredor, who had served in the U-boat arm himself. And he realized that in the post-war Germany, essentially nobody was interested in this stuff. So he sort of, began on a very personal basis collecting material, collecting first-hand accounts, collecting photographs. I mean, a lot of the photographs that we see scrolling through are from that archive. And that sort of grew and grew, and it's still a private archive. Horst Bredor died, I think, in 2012. But it is the most complete archive of the German U-boat arm, actually in both wars, First World War as well. Because people sort of got wind of it and they started, you had, perhaps widows or the next of kin of submariners who would then send material in, or they would make requests and say, well, what do we know about this person who served on this vessel? And it became a sort of a hub for all of that information. So, and it's fantastic. And they have in their archive a lot of these sort of first-hand accounts and unpublished material, as well as published as well. So some of it's, you've got published memoirs only published in German, and then lots of unpublished material that's been sent into the archive. So a sort of trawl through that, and you do get these perspectives, some really interesting material comes out of it. Not least, actually, which I'm sure we'll come on to, but about sort of things like combat stress and the mental health of submariners, which I think was quite remarkable.
But is there, I suppose, a slight selection bias in that archive, in that since most of the U-boats, when they go down, they just disappear and they can't be recovered. So what you have is only from survivors, which, as you point out, is a very small proportion of U-boat, people who serve on U-boats.
Yes,
so
1 in 4.
Yeah, so do you have a sense of what might be missing from that 75% who've just gone down and we'll never know?
Yeah, you do have an insight even into those crews that were total losses, as you just described, which is, actually the majority are total losses. Certainly in their Kriegstagebücher, their war diaries. So each vessel had to keep a war diary for each patrol it was on, and at the end of the patrol, it was handed in. Right, and then that finds its place in the official record. So even if they're lost on the next patrol and it's a total loss and everything and everyone is lost at that point, you still have these war diaries from previous missions, and they can be very sort of lapidary. They can be very terse. So it's written by the commander of the vessel. So it might say, sea condition X. It might say, wind strength Y, and little else. Engaged convoy, whatever it might be. Or some of them actually just had sort of literary pretensions, and they would sort of write about the crew, and they write about what was going on in the day and daily life. So you have an insight there as well through those war diaries that actually are a bit more forthcoming.
So then, does that get harder later in the war to get those official records? Because you mentioned this kind of deterioration of training that goes on as the older, more experienced crews sort of die off and they're replaced by younger recruits and conscripts. So more and more ships are being lost on their maiden voyage, which means they wouldn't have the target books to go back to.
Yeah.
So does it become harder to get into their minds as you get further into the war?
I think that's fair. Yes, if you had in terms of the broad spread of the material, it does tail off. That is certainly true, and even the Allied accounts. The other aspect is the Allied interrogation accounts. So those where the British, but also the Americans, mainly the British actually, captured U-boat crews and then interrogated them. And you've got two sources there. You've got the official report that they did, which is a sort of a collection and a précis of all the material that they thought was interesting from the interrogation of that crew. And then you've also got the raw material, particularly from Trent Park, where they were eavesdropping on the prisoners themselves. So you can see what conversations they were having amongst themselves, which is really interesting. So there's sort of two sources there. But that material really peters out, I think, from about mid-44 onwards. There's kind of nothing. Because they're not taking prisoners. There's nobody left to take prisoners. Because of the technological shift, the logistical shift in the middle of the war, by that stage, it's pretty rare to take prisoners because they're all total losses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting point that you come back to several times. And Karl Donitz, who's obviously the head of the submarine division and then becomes head of the Navy and then eventually becomes Hitler's, sorry, and then eventually becomes Hitler's successor.
Yeah.
He described himself as body and soul a submariner.
Yes.
So having done this research, do you think that there's a difference between sailors and submariners, never mind soldiers or Luftwaffe pilots?
I do, actually, which again, I think surprised me. I suppose maybe I should have managed to cadge a ride on a modern submarine, if that's even possible. Probably isn't. But, just to experience the sort of the sense of claustrophobia that it brings. But I think it's that element that is crucial here. You see that, and I mentioned it a bit in terms of looking at the training that they underwent and how they put together a crew. There's essentially nowhere to hide on a submarine. So you have to have a crew, and it's about 50 men in a standard, Type 7 U-boat, which incidentally is a remarkably small thing. There's one surviving Type 7, which is at a place called Labour, near Kiel on the German Baltic coast. And it's up on the beach at Labour. And you can walk through it, and you literally you walk in the stern and out to the front, out to the bow, and out again. You could do it in 5 minutes. I've done this, many times. And what strikes you is the the sheer claustrophobia of it. It's terrifying. You walk through this thing, it's about the size of maybe 2 sort of London Underground carriages, okay? And it's filled with, massive diesel engines, the electric motors, hand wheels and gauges and all sorts of things. And then you've got torpedoes and men, which are all sort of strewn together. You see some of these pictures that are scrolling, like this one now. The men are everyone's absolutely on top of each other. They live amongst their own torpedoes, the men. So it's a pretty frightful existence. There's only one place where 2 grown men could pass each other in the Type 7 without sort of doing an embarrassing sort of shuffle. It's a tiny thing, and you come through this thing, and at the end it has a sort of information board. It says it has a crew of 50, and you go, well, how the hell did they even function? I mean, where did they stand? I mean, it's crazy. So that sense of claustrophobia that you get, that you have to sort of imagine yourself getting, is the root of a lot of the problems in terms of combat stress, definitely, in terms of how commanders had to very carefully kind of almost create and curate a crew. You couldn't have anyone that was too independently minded. You couldn't have anyone that was oppositional, because there's nowhere to hide. You could get away with that on a surface ship, perhaps, because if someone was being difficult, you just post them to the stern, and the person they're fighting with, you post them somewhere else, right? And,
so
there's lots of fresh air.
Aircraft carriers,
exactly.
Thousands of people on them.
But you can't. That doesn't work in a U-boat. So I think that element of the stress involved and the claustrophobia, I think it does mean that there's a difference between submariners and ordinary naval personnel.
I think you mentioned 2 things there that I found interesting. One, I don't know about the rest of you, but I certainly would not like to sleep next to a torpedo in my spare time. But also the fact that you can't have too much of a personality, almost, it sounds like, in order to function, in order to have a well-functioning submarine. You all have to be in your tiny little box and be happy to sit there.
Yeah.
So do you get, from the records, do you see people using their diaries or their personal kind of accounts as ways of almost venting that steam to put it somewhere?
I would just question the premise. I think you do see that, and this is where it was so important for the commanders to curate their own crew. They would look. An interesting thing is that the sort of socio-economic makeup of U-boat crews was very different from other branches of the military. So you couldn't necessarily just take a sort of peasant boy from East Prussia, give him a rifle and some basic training, and stick him in a submarine. You can do that in the infantry. You can't do it in a submarine because everybody has specialist tasks to carry out. So what they tended to prioritize was people with manual skills, so mechanics, plumbers, electricians, and so on, which meant that you're going very obviously for working class and lower middle class socioeconomic groups, right? And very often from urban areas, and very often from inland, incidentally, as well. So they didn't necessarily just go for, Hamburg, Lübeck, and so on. And there's a sort of a cynical argument or suggestion that perhaps that was deliberate, that, young boys from Lübeck and Danzig or from Hamburg kind of knew slightly too much about the reality of life on the sea. Mm-hmm. So they tend to be disproportionately from places like Westphalia, Saxony, and so on. So inland territories. So that socioeconomic profile is quite different from other branches of service. Mm-hmm. And it is, as I said, particularly those with sort of practical skills. And I think in terms of, how a commander would sort of put together his crew, they're very, very conscious that you need to have, they'd look for people who had experience of team sport, for example. Mm. And they'd look for people who perhaps could play an accordion or a harmonica.
Oh,
so it's all,
people.
So you're saying that there was, to some degree, there would be an empty vessel when they express themselves in their diaries. I think they wanted them to express themselves with the crew, but obviously in a positive way. Mm. So the whole, the deliberate fostering of some sort of camaraderie in the crew is quite an obvious thing.
Which I think this is an interesting point, because there's been research done about how armies have these kind of shows that they put on, and a lot of them are drag shows or performances. They're sort of ridiculous cabaret type things. But that's when you're in the military and have all of this space and have lines that you can go back to. How do you fit a party onto a U-boat that's this small?
They do. So, for example, if you ever, I don't think there are any pictures on this that are coming through, but there are some pictures available of, the quayside where they're victualling the U-boats before they go out, which is tons and tons of supplies, food, bread, meat, vegetables, all sorts of things. A lot of tinned stuff for when the fresh stuff runs out, But a key thing was crates and crates of beer. They had Beck's beer was the thing. And they used to have crates and crates of Beck's beer. And they used to have these evenings, obviously when they could, when they, felt relatively safe wherever they were, where, the captain would say, okay, we're going to have a, Feierabend and we're going to enjoy ourselves. So they did. So they basically had a party. I mean, obviously you couldn't get completely blotto in that experience, but they did it. And it was a necessary thing to allow the crew to sort of work off that steam, to blow off the steam that they might have from the stress of the mission. And in terms of, you said that sort of cabaret shows, or you alluded to that, right? There's one thing that stuck out to me, and I hadn't heard of this, having not done necessarily sort of maritime history before. The crossing the lines ceremony. Did you see that in the book? And there's some remarkable pictures of it available. Crossing the equator was a big thing, and has always been a big thing for sailors. But they even managed to have that ceremony on U-boats as well, and it was a key part of the sort of ceremonial in the vessel and in the crew. It was a key part of inducting new crew members into the team, sort of thing. It sounds a bit like quite brutal hazing, which I suppose to some degree it was, because it was quite nasty.
It's military bonding, yes.
It's military bonding, yeah.
But I did think, when the way you described it, they bring a wig in it, and I just loved this idea that some submariner who is allowed to bring apparently one change of underwear per month or something, is using up his precious space to bring like a wig and a dress for when they cross the equator, he can dress up as the god of the sea.
Yeah,
I enjoyed that.
And it's such and I've seen the original certificate, one of these original certificates that they issued to a new crew member who had never crossed the equator before. There's one of these on display actually in the archive that I mentioned in Cuxhaven. And it's a wonderful thing. You were then free to, you had the freedom of the seas and your choice of all the mermaids as well, which was a crucial thing.
Do the mermaids get a say in this?
There's no mention of the mermaids apart from that, I'm afraid. I do apologise.
But this then, you've mentioned a couple of times the commanders making these decisions. And in the book as well, you talk about different commanders with their different management styles, if you like. And so there's one in particular, the name escapes me, but it seemed very puritanical.
Yes.
And may have been less enthused about having crates and crates of beer coming onto the boat.
Yes, Wolfgang Luth.
Yes.
Yes.
So how big an influence do you think the commander of a U-boat has on how happy the crew is, and then by extension, how successful that crew is?
Oh, completely. It's very much down to the individual. And Luth is a very interesting case because he's hugely successful. He is very puritanical. He banned pin-ups, for example. He used to vet all of the reading material that his crew brought on board so that they didn't have sort of a false cover of, Mein Kampf, for example, and then what was inside would be an erotic novel. That was not allowed. So he used to personally vet all of their reading material.
Having read Mein Kampf, I do think that would be a better option.
I think he probably would, exactly. He wouldn't allow pin-ups. He said if you were starving, you wouldn't have a picture of bread on the wall, which is a fair comment, I think. So this was his attitude, and he's a very fervent Nazi, but from sort of a sort of uber-conservative side, so not the sort of revolutionary side, if you like. As you know, Nazism has this, is a curious amalgam of various political strands. He's very much on that, uber-conservative side, so very Christian. He encouraged his men always to get married and have children, even when they went ashore, and that could always be a bit of a bacchanal, when they got to Lorient or Saint-Malo, wherever it was. First thing, they'd get cleaned up because they were filthy, and then they would go and, enjoy the pleasures of Saint-Malo, as naval personnel have since time immemorial. But he used to accompany his officers and basically just wag the finger at them constantly, which would be quite annoying. Especially, obviously, the married ones were on absolutely strict. Thou shalt not.
Well, on one level, good for him on that
Yeah,
one.
yeah.
For all the single lads, less fun.
Less so, yeah, yeah. But he was hugely successful. He was hugely respected by his crews. You know, and I think that comes down to some degree to what we're saying about the sort of curating a crew, that I'm sure he ran up against some opposition, and those that sort of, you know, took him the wrong way and couldn't bear him would be shipped out to a different crew, because, as I said, you can't sort of brook any dissent within that close environment.
So then would it be fair to say that U-boats would be more likely to have crew moving around compared to in the army, you just sort of get dumped into a unit and that's your unit until you get wounded and may come back somewhere else.
Yeah.
But with the U-boats, because you're in these close quarters and because you have this very particular kind of environment, is there more rotation to get the right crews put together?
Well, just to illustrate, I wouldn't necessarily say more, but I suppose if you were lucky enough to have served through 1939 to 45 in the U-boat arm, I think statistically you probably would have been on maybe 4 or 5 U-boats in that time. Certainly you wouldn't necessarily have been in one all the way through, because they did have this sort of rotation policy, and very often that was, you know, it was personal in some examples as I've just described, or, you know, you were sent on a sort of training course, and in the meantime the rest of the crew went off and your particular role had been replaced by someone else, and then you'd be transferred somewhere else. So that was just kind of happenstance. So there was a degree of rotation, definitely, yeah.
And then you mentioned the training just there. And one of the things that comes across, to me at least in the book, is that there's a real deterioration in how much training and how successful the training is.
Yes.
And so what is the shortening, if you like? You know, how long is the training when they're at peacetime compared to by the end of the war? How much training is a submariner actually getting?
At the beginning of the war, so that first generation of U-boat commanders, you know, the names that people might know, people like Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer and so on, that those that were raised to the status of celebrities in Nazi Germany in the opening years of the war, they very often had, you know, pre-war naval experience, so they'd been in the Navy, you know, meant very often for years before they'd even joined the submarine service. They then had experience in the submarine service in peacetime, in the years running up to the outbreak of war in '39. So for someone like Günther Prien, for example, he joined the German Navy in 1933. He'd moved across to the U-boat arm, I think in '36, and then so had 4 years of peacetime. He survived and he was killed in 1941. So you can see that, you know, the span of his career is impressive. Actually, before his transfer to the Kriegsmarine, he was in the German Merchant Marine. So he'd been a professional sailor, right? By the end of the war, in stark contrast, and you know, for those coming in cold as a recruit, you know, you had basic training in the Navy, then you'd be selected for the U-boat arm. You'd have various sort of areas of sort of skill that you had to master. Might be gunnery, it might be navigation, whatever, radio operator. But you know, those were all sort of training courses. You had, you know, period on a vessel. So at the beginning of the war, even for a fresh recruit, you're still talking about years rather than months, right? At the end of the war, that's been so telescoped of necessity that you have commanders who are sort of 23 and weren't even in the Navy at the beginning of the war. You have crewmen who have basically had essentially maybe 6 or 8 weeks of training, and they're now, you know, carrying out a task on a U-boat. So that cannot but have a knock-on effect on the experience of the crew, on the ability of the crew to deal with the inevitable crises that they face.
Well, I was just going to ask about you know, we've mentioned the psychological stress of being on a U-boat, and I, as someone with claustrophobia, would hate this. Worst nightmare. But so do you then see an increase in people who are having difficulties on the U-boats as the training becomes lower and lower, and as less people are consciously choosing? You know, because at the start of the war, people are choosing to sign up for the U-boats and they're volunteering for the U-boat division. But then by the end of the war, they're all conscripts, right?
Yeah.
So is
Well,
there...
conscription is brought in right at the beginning. So, you know, the pre-war U-boat arm is essentially volunteers from the service, from the naval recruits. And then it just becomes, you know, you will take a tranche of naval recruits and make them submariners. And that was based on aptitude. You know, as I said, if you were a mechanic or a plumber, you were probably, you know, looking good. They liked people to be relatively short. So you and I would be okay, which is a good thing. So under 5'8", and you'd probably be ideal for.
I'm 5'10".
You're feeling left out now.
Oh no, I can't serve in a U-boat.
And single, of course. So there's a lovely scene that I have in the book, which came from a memoir of the selection procedure, and they do say, you know, that they've got that tranche of recruits, and they say, you know, anyone under 5'8" step forward, and some of them do, and then the next question, you know, of those same, how many of you are single, step forward, and they step forward again, and then they say, does anyone want to volunteer for the U-boat service? Nobody steps forward. But they say, well, here's our recruits, you know, they're single and under 5'8" is good enough.
Mm-hmm. I remember reading that part, and I thought that is a very visceral, very human kind of response to this. And so I was wondering, because you don't talk about the aftermath of the war all that much. I'm aware, obviously, the book, it's a relatively short book for quite a long war, so you cover a lot of ground.
Yep.
But what is essentially the duty of care that then Germany has to what must be a high number of traumatized U-boat submariners when they get out of the war?
Yes.
Do you have any knowledge of the records or what happens to people after the war?
The short answer to that is probably no, but then bear in mind that Germany post-war is full of traumatized people of various stripes, whether as perpetrators or victims or everything in between. So in that sense, there's nothing particularly unusual about them. But of those, you know, as I said, 1 in 4 of the U-boat arm, and it's 40,000, so 10,000 actually survived the war. I think it's fair to say that probably, I would say at least half, if not the majority of those, were damaged to some extent by the experience. There was one personal story, which I do mention in the book. I kind of can't claim it as an origin story for the book, which would be much more, you know, the journalists would love it, put it that way. So we had a sort of family lunch. I'd actually already started working on the book. We had a family lunch. And my mother-in-law, who is German, announced that her uncle was in the U-boat arm. And I'd never heard this, you know. So I was sort of dumbstruck, and I said, well, how have I never heard this story before? She said, yeah, you know, I remember him. He used to come to the house after the war. I said, really? He said, yeah, he used to come to the house, and we had to call the police every time, and they had to take him back to the hospital. So he spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital, from which he used to escape and go to the only place which he knew, which was the family home. And they had the duty to, they would, you know, their duty was to call the police, take him away again.
Yeah.
And that I thought was kind of instructive of, you know, a deeper truth, that these were profoundly damaged people.
And that there's not a huge amount of treatment available to them.
No.
Or even, I mean, is there understanding, even during the war, is there an increase in the understanding about the impact of combat stress, PTSD, those kind of psychological conditions?
This was a really interesting, I think a revelation, really. I found a couple of accounts in the archive from naval doctors who are looking into this during the war. And they say, there's a brief report that they wrote where they talk about the fact that the higher-ups are not interested because this conflicts with the sort of the Nazi, you know, image of martial valor and all of that stuff. So they're not sort of willing to really sort of pursue this. And a lot of the men themselves don't want to talk about it for obvious reasons, for the same reason that it's seen as a form of weakness or whatever. But from their sort of necessarily sort of piecemeal research and treatment or attempts at treatment, they say that this is an iceberg. It's a tip of an iceberg, but the iceberg is there. Once I read that, and then then you go back and you look at some of the personal accounts, and you can see people, you know, there was one commander, for example, who had chronic insomnia, and he used to sort of, bearing in mind that the average type 7 that I mentioned, is essentially a submersible. It stays on the surface as most of the time. It's designed to stay on the surface. It can submerge, you know, to either attack or to evade attack, but then it ultimately has to come up again. And it's meant to live on the surface. But he used to take his down to 50 meters so that it was nice and stable and he could sleep, or try to sleep. So, you know, again, there's no explicit commentary in that says, you know, this man was suffering from combat stress, but it's a fair assumption.
One would have to.
There's a couple of examples of commanders, for example, having nervous breakdowns, you know, during their tours. One of them, quite well-known commander called Heinrich Bleichroth, who's actually responsible for the sinking of the city of Benares, which is quite a notorious sinking, because there are a lot of evacuee children on board, which he didn't know, obviously. He didn't even know that it was the city of Benares when he sank it. There's no way he could have known who was on board. When he discovered that later on, you know, the subsequent couple of missions that he went on were okay, and then he mysteriously has a nervous breakdown, and I think it's fair to assume it was the knowledge of what he'd done.
Yeah, I'm not sure how mysterious it is if you're
No,
reflecting.
no, exactly. So, but all of that is, you know, once you accept that this is a possibility, that they're suffering from combat stress, you can see it everywhere. You can see it in, you know, radio operators who are sort of struck dumb after a depth charging attack, you know, temporarily, or like I said, you know, anxiety attacks, or there are accounts of, you know, particularly during depth charging attacks, of even the officers, you know, wide-eyed and sort of, you know, screaming and running through the vessel. And I think they're the ones that are supposed to hold everything together. This is like being in an airplane and the crew start panicking. That means everyone else panics, right? So this is a very bad sign. But this, again, it's an indicator that this is a widespread problem.
And I think this is an interesting point. Towards the end of the book, you mentioned quite a few commanders who make the decision to go down with their ship through varying degrees of accident, deliberate, conscious choice.
Yep.
And so would you attribute some of those who are making that as a decision to combat stress, this kind of fatigue area? Like, how would you explain or understand those decisions?
I think it could be a contributory factor in that respect, but I think that's much more, I would say, taking a way out which is seen as honorable, almost like a sort of, you know, Japanese warrior, a samurai sort of thing. It's that, you know, the end is nigh. I don't want to go into captivity. You don't know what that will be. There was all sorts of, you know, lurid stories on both sides during the war in terms of the propaganda that was put out about how POWs would be treated. So the assumption was, and there's a couple of accounts that I mentioned right at the end of people saying, well, I'm not going to surrender because, you know, I'm just going to, you know, we're going to be abused as a nation. We're going to be, you know, we're going to be the, you know, the whipping boys of the Allies and this sort of thing, going to be occupied. And so I think in that sense, I think it's probably a more, dare I say, a rational decision, because it's a world that they don't want to necessarily see, and they're taking a way out which they know for their next of kin, if you like, would be seen as an honourable one.
And I think, because I'm aware of the time, and I'm sure you guys have plenty of questions yourselves. So my last question, was there, when you're sifting through this huge amount of information and all of these personal accounts, was there any particular story or moment or person that you found, but you couldn't find a way to fit them into narrative here?
Goodness. I mean, there are so many, actually. No, I think I was quite happy that I got everything in that I wanted. There were a few that I was particularly keen on. There was a chap called Oskar Kusch, who was a commander who was, again, very young. I think he was 24. He was quite a fervent anti-Nazi, actually. And he was eventually arrested for, you know, essentially persistently saying the wrong thing. He used to give commentary, so they had to read out, you know, Dönitz's sort of order of the day and so on. He would do that because that was his duty, and then afterwards he would give his own commentary, where he'd say, you know, by the way, lads, this is all a load of Nazi nonsense, and, you know, just basically sort of contradict everything that his commander-in-chief had just said. He was eventually found out, so one of his junior officers was a convinced Nazi and, you know, dobbed him into the Gestapo, and he was arrested and subsequently imprisoned. on death row and was executed. So it's a fascinating example, and he's one that I think, you know, in a sense we should remember, I suppose, the variety really of, you know, as I said, this is all German society represented, all the way from fervent Nazis to those less convinced. And I think that to me, I think was a sort of fascinating lesson.
Yeah, and I think that is a wonderful note to end our particular conversation.